So this painting is a study of a painting by Wyeth called The Prospector. I really like the composition and the colors of the mountains behind the figure, but also some of the subtle coloration on the rocks down below him, and also the way he's catching light, like the top half of his upper body and arms are in light, but then his legs are in shadow. On the right there, the upper picture is just a photo of the actual painting as a reference. And then the black and white below it is a study that I did earlier. I was trying to do just a value study. I think it's not super accurate, but I kept it up there because I really liked some of the marks that I made, and I'll look back at that later when I'm doing the final couple of passes on the full study. Trying to get some of those marks that I really liked in that black and white study. So even though it's not exactly a good value study, it's still helpful to have. So right here I'm putting in the first couple of passes, just some color on the mountains there, and then started working in a couple of different colors, that sort of reddish pink and then greenish, as just color hue variations in the sky, kind of that grayish blue background. This brush that I'm using, you can kind of see it just kind of throws out a bunch of kind of rectangles of various sizes. If I use a lot of pressure on the pen, the squares or rectangles are a lot larger and a lot more opaque. If I don't bear down as hard, it's a lot smaller line. It doesn't spread out the marks as much, but it's also more transparent. The area on the right side there, that kind of greenish and purple, is really nice, so I'm going to really make sure to spend a lot of time there later to get those very subtle purples and pinks and greens into the cliffside there. So with the rocks here that I'm just laying in, if you notice higher up in the rocks, it's definitely a lot more red, and then as you go down it becomes sort of a yellowish green with a little bit more gray. I think a little later I kind of put more of that in, but as I finish this, I'm definitely going to try and keep some of those subtle variations as well. Something I've noticed a lot recently, both in digital paintings and traditional, your colors are defined by the values around them that are not saturated. So if you have a gray right next to even a very lightly saturated color, that color will stand out next to that gray value, and I think with those rocks there, that's going to be a really important thing to remember. I usually make my colors too saturated, but as you can see in that reference there, they're not very highly saturated, not nearly as much as I have right now. So I'm going to have to kind of tone those down a little bit, but that'll help the areas of color that I do add to really stand out. I think that's true also for the sky. The sky is, I think, a little too saturated right now, but I was trying to capture some of that very subtle coloration. But if I kind of gray everything down and then go back and add just a slight bit of saturation, that'll really help it stand out more, because it's got that neutrality to stand out against. At this point, I'm not super worried about getting everything the right shape. I'm just mostly laying in just the areas of color. I'll add shape later and then add details. For now, the most important thing is building up colors so I can shape everything later. Usually you would want to get shapes sketched in first, but for this study I'm focusing on color, so I'm layering that in first. As far as layers go, I think I only have 3 in this painting right now, and I'll probably try and keep it to around that. I don't like using a lot of layers. If you're trying to switch back and forth between traditional art and digital painting, you don't want to get too dependent on using layers, because it's a lot harder in real life to do anything like that. So relying on layers to do everything for you essentially is going to teach you some bad habits, again, about fundamental shape design, things like that. Obviously, if you're doing something like concept art where you need to change a lot of things very quickly, you don't want to put everything down in stone, it can be very helpful to use layers, and depending on what you want your end goal to be, layers can be very useful. So you just need to think about whether or not that's a requirement or necessary for whatever you're making. I try not to zoom in like this very often. You can see I got most of the major shapes done without zooming in the canvas very much, and that helps you keep better track of how the shapes are all playing together, which is probably the most important part of the early stages of a painting. It doesn't really matter what the colors look like, as long as you're capturing the major forms and some of the light and shadow. You can start building on top of that later. But if you have a very lopsided, wonky, badly shaped foundation, you're not gonna save it by putting a ton of color on top of it or something like that. You have to make sure you got all those basic shapes down correctly. You can see there I experimented with the same brush but just using the round shapes instead of the rectangles, and it doesn't really work in my opinion, because you're not able to get some of the kind of suggestion of direction. With those rectangles, they all face in the direction of your stroke, and you can use that to suggest direction with the mark, which is really important. I know there are some very good artists that I was kind of trying to emulate there that are able to use kind of a round stippled brush, but I'm not sure how they do it, so I'm gonna stick with what I know best right now. As far as color picking goes, you can see I use the eyedropper tool a lot, but that's because I've laid down a lot of color already. To begin with, the way I choose the colors is just a color wheel, and then with Krita there's a tool called the digital color selector. I'm not sure exactly what it's called, but it essentially lets you add little bits of other color into what you have. So they have green, red, blue, yellow, and then white and black. I think those are the ones they have, and you just basically can tell it how much color you want to add to what you have, and that's really useful if you have a neutral gray and you want to add warm to it. You can do that incrementally. You don't have to mess around with the color wheel. If you want to add a little bit of red, you can just add red. If you want to add blue or green or whatever, you can add that. There's a lot more color harmony because you're just building off of the same value instead of trying to pick colors that are close to each other. You know they're always going to work well together. So here I tried using a more traditional brush because I was kind of struggling with some of those very small details there of the shadows and the snow on the mountains. I used it for a couple minutes, but then I realized I need to get more of everything else, more of those basic shapes done before I move to trying any sort of details. So you see I use it for a little bit here, but it doesn't really look that good because I don't think I'm quite ready to move to that stage yet. I was getting too focused on those details in the mountains instead of putting really any detail into the figures or the rock. And that's important to remember. I know I've said that a couple of times, but if you don't have good shapes, just adding details isn't going to help anything, and it'll probably make it look worse because it'll look very unnatural. You can have a very unfinished looking painting in terms of the amount of detail, but if all the shapes are there and they're all correct, it's going to look like a finished piece that just isn't as detailed as some other finished piece. But if you try and add a lot of detail to a painting that doesn't have a good structure and foundation underneath it, it's never going to look finished because there's always going to be something fundamentally off about it. Of course, if you're going for a surrealist or a non-objective painting style, you're going to treat it completely differently. So right here, I noticed that mountain on the left side was just too low, comparing it to the height of the figure. So I just used a lasso tool to grab that mountain and then stretch it up some. That's about it for now. I'll finish this painting and get the second video edited and uploaded, hopefully sometime next week. If you follow me on Instagram, I'll post there when I have that finished.